The flagstone moved. Cecily Hargrove had not expected it to move. She had been pressing the flat of her palm against the chapel floor because she could not sleep, because the late Countess of Ashmore's death had left her without a station and without a future, and without any clear understanding of what her days were now for. And the chapel was the one room at Ashmore that no one from the Pell household had yet seen fit to inspect, redecorate, or lock. She had come there in the early morning gray, before the household woke, because the silence belonged to no one in particular, and silence had become her closest companion in the 3 weeks since she had been told her services were no longer required. She had been running her palm along the floor in a small, absent motion, the way one's hand moves without instruction when the mind is elsewhere, and the stone shifted. Not by much, a fraction of an inch, perhaps, the sound of it a low scrape against its neighbor, a sound that did not belong in a chapel floor that had been laid for centuries. Cecily sat very still. The light through the chapel's single eastern window was pale and thin, barely enough to see by, and she could hear the morning birds beginning their noise outside. She looked at the stone. It was the third flagstone from the altar rail, set close to the left wall, no different from any of the others to look at. She pressed again at the outer edge, and it rocked a hair's breadth on whatever space lay beneath it. She was not a woman given to impulsiveness. She was 24 years old and had nothing left to lose, and so she found a slender iron candlestick from the altar and fitted its base into the gap and levered, gently, until the flagstone lifted enough for her to get her fingers beneath. What she found, in the hollow beneath that stone, changed everything. It would not be clear to her for some weeks how much. She knew even then, kneeling on the cold chapel floor in the early gray of an October morning, with a folded sheaf of parchment in her hands, and a small, tarnished brass key on a worn leather cord resting against her palm, that she was holding something that had been deliberately hidden. She knew, before she read a word of it, that someone had not wanted it found. She had been at Ashmore for 4 years in the service of Lady Eleanor, the late Countess, who had valued 2 things above most others: her morning chocolate, and a woman who could read aloud without stumbling. Cecily had been 16 when her mother died, and 20 when she took the position, and she had come to love the Countess with the specific and uncomplicated devotion of a young woman who has lost her own family and found in service a kind of ordered tenderness. Lady Eleanor had been precise, demanding, and unexpectedly fair. She had also been old, and she had died in August, quietly, in her own bed, with Cecily at her side, reading aloud from a volume of natural philosophy the Countess had never finished. Cecily had continued reading for some minutes after. She was not certain why. The Countess's hands still beneath the coverlet, and the room very still. The book describing the migrations of swallows across the Mediterranean in a prose so precise it seemed somehow appropriate. She had only stopped when the housekeeper came in and gently closed the book for her. She had not read that volume since, though it remained on the shelf in the room she was no longer certain she was permitted to occupy. The estate had passed into the hands of the Ashmore executor, the Earl of Greystone, until probate was complete and Lionel Pell could formally take possession. Greystone had arrived in September, a tall, lean man of 34, with gray eyes and a dark navy tailcoat, and a manner so precisely controlled it registered, at first acquaintance, as coldness. He had brought 2 clerks, a stack of correspondence, and no apparent interest in anyone employed at the estate. He had set up his operations in the late Earl's study, and he had worked from 8 in the morning until 9 at night with the door closed, and in the 3 weeks since his arrival, he had spoken to Cecily exactly twice. Mrs. Dorothea Pell had arrived with her son Lionel 2 days after the executor. She was a full-figured woman of 56, with silver-streaked hair dressed in elaborate pearl-pinned curls and a deep claret gown that had been cut for someone who expected to be obeyed in it. She had walked through Ashmore's entrance hall and looked at it in a way that suggested she was already measuring it for new curtains. She had been gracious to the housekeeper, precise with the cook, and upon being introduced to Cecily had paused just long enough to say, in a voice pitched for her son's ear, "The reading companion. We shall not be requiring that, Lionel. She is only a servant." She had not lowered her voice. Cecily had done what she always did. She smoothed her face into an expression that revealed nothing, and she had returned to the task of cataloguing the late Countess's personal library, which was the only work she had found to give herself in the days between her position ending and the moment she would have to leave. She had not known then that she was not quite finished at Ashmore. She had not known there was anything hidden beneath the chapel floor. The document in Cecily's hands was a will. A will in the late Earl's own hand, she was almost certain, recognizing the spare slanted script from the correspondence she had organized for the Countess over 4 years. It was dated in the spring of 1814. The will currently in probate was dated in 1811. The document she held was 3 years newer, witnessed by 2 signatures she did not recognize, and sealed with the Ashmore device in wax that had gone brittle with time. She read it twice in the thin morning light. She read it a 3rd time because she did not entirely trust herself. Then she folded it with the care she would have given a living thing, tucked the brass key into her pocket alongside it, and went to find the Earl of Greystone. He was already at his desk. The fire had been lit, and the candles were burning, and he was reading something in that particular way he had, his head slightly bent, and his eyes moving in very controlled passes across the page, as though reading were a procedure to be executed correctly rather than a pleasure to be had. He looked up when she knocked and entered, and his gray eyes moved across her once, efficient and unrevealing. "Miss Hargrove?" he said. "It is early." "It is," she said. "I beg your pardon for the hour. I have found something that I believe you must see." She placed the document on the desk before him. She set the brass key beside it. And then she stood back, with her hands folded at her waist, and she watched his face as he read. He was not a man whose face changed easily. She had already learned this much in 3 weeks. She watched something happen behind those gray eyes as he reached the 2nd page. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was some compound of both, arriving and departing too quickly to name. He read it through entirely. He turned back to the beginning and read the 1st page again. Then he was still for a long moment, and the only sound in the room was the fire. "Where did you find this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The chapel," she said. "The floor. The 3rd flagstone from the altar rail, set against the left wall." He looked at her. It was the first time, she thought, that he had truly looked at her, rather than registering her presence in the room as a piece of information relevant to the task at hand. "You found it this morning. Within the last hour." He was still watching her. She felt it in the skin of her throat. That particular quality of being seen, and she did not permit herself to look away. "Do you understand what this document is?" he said. "I believe it is a later will," she said. "One that supersedes the document currently in your possession. I am named in it." A pause. "You are," he said. "I read it carefully," she said. "I am not mistaken." He looked down at the document again, and she could see him thinking, not calculating precisely, but thinking, in the way of a man who takes seriously every obligation his position carries, and was now confronting an obligation he had not anticipated. The firelight found the line of his jaw, the vertical crease between his brows that she had come to understand was not impatience, but concentration. "I will require time to review this properly," he said, "and to send for a second opinion. Remain at the estate, if you please." "I have nowhere else to go," she said, with a steadiness she did not quite feel. At the moment, something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite there, and then it was gone. "Then you will remain," he said. She left him to his reading. 2 days later, she returned to the chapel. She went back for the reason she had told herself she was going, to examine the hollow beneath the stone to see whether anything else had been concealed there. She came also because the chapel was still the only room at Ashmore that felt like it did not belong to anyone's agenda. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, having found nothing additional, when she heard a small sound at the doorway. Tommy, the youngest of the stable hands, was standing with his cap in both hands, looking uncertain. He was 12 and slight, with a bruised knuckle from the horse's work, and a way of arranging his face into apology that she recognized as a child's learned defense. "They said it was locked," he said. "The big man's men said. I only wanted to sit a moment." "It is not locked," she said. "Come in, if you like." He came in and sat on the end of the rear pew, cap still in his hands. After a moment, he said, "Are you going away, miss?" "The other girls say everyone's going away." "I do not know yet," Cecily said. "I think I might." She reached for the small prayer book on the window ledge, which had been there as long as she had been at Ashmore, worn and thin-paged and belonging to no one in particular, and opened it to the 23rd Psalm, which she had read at the late Countess's bedside, and which seemed as good a choice as any. She began to read aloud, slowly, explaining the words that would not be familiar to a boy of 12 who could not read. He was a good listener, Tommy. He leaned forward a little on the pew as she read, his cap still working between his fingers, and when she explained that the valley of the shadow of death was not a geography one walked through only once, but sometimes carried inside oneself for years, he considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom such explanations were not condescending but simply new information. He asked her, when she finished the psalm, if it meant the bad parts ended. She said she believed they did, eventually. She said it with more conviction than she felt, because conviction was the thing she still had to offer. And conviction costs nothing to give when the person receiving it has so little. She did not know she was not alone. She did not know that the Earl of Greystone had come to the chapel for his own reasons, to examine the flagstone and satisfy himself about the location and the concealment, and had stopped at the doorway when he heard her voice, and had stood there for the full length of that reading in the cold October light, not announcing himself, watching a woman who was about to lose her only home read comfort to a child she had no reason to comfort. He left before she finished. She never knew he had been there. What happened next happened quickly, as trouble tends to when those with something to lose decide they have delayed long enough. Greystone had been discreet in his inquiries, but discretion in a house full of Pell servants is a limited commodity. By the third day after Cecily's discovery, it was clear to Mrs. Dorothea Pell that something had shifted in the executor's manner, and she was a woman acute enough to know that shifts in an executor's manner do not occur for pleasant reasons. The dinner that Mrs. Pell arranged for the following evening was presented as a courtesy, an occasion for the principals to dine together before the formal proceedings resumed. She arranged it with the efficiency of a general disposing troops, and she arrived at table in a fresh gown of deep claret, with her pearl choker high at her throat, with Lionel at her right and Mr. Abel Trask, the family solicitor, positioned beside Greystone in the way that one positions a buttress beside a wall one is not entirely certain of. Greystone sat at the head of the table with his usual stillness. Cecily, at the table, because Greystone had directed the housekeeper to seat her, was at the far end in her plain gray-green gown, which sat as it always had beside the jewelry and silk of those around her. Honest, plain, and quiet. It was Lionel Pell who spoke first. In that light, dismissive register he had inherited from his mother, along with everything else. He was addressing Greystone, but he pitched his voice for the table. "I understand," he said, "that one of the household staff has presented a document for your consideration. A curious business." He reached for his wine. "Though I cannot think how a thing of legal weight would come to be found by a servant. She is only a servant, after all, and one with no standing in the estate's affairs." Greystone did not answer immediately. He turned his glass once in his fingers. "Documents come to light in unexpected ways," he said. "Quite so," Lionel said, smiling. "Still, one must consider the source." Cecily kept her eyes on her plate. After dinner, when the company had dispersed to the drawing room, Greystone came to stand at the tall library window, looking out at the dark grounds. He did not summon her. He simply remained there, in a way that did not quite exclude her presence, and after a moment she crossed the room and stood near enough to be addressed. "I have written to London," he said. "There is a man there who knew the late Earl's handwriting better than any other. I expect his reply within the week. And if he confirms it, then the will is valid and the consequences follow." The fire was low and the room was cooling toward night, and the candle she held made a small warm point of light between them. She could hear his breathing in the quiet. She was aware, with a clarity that had been growing for some days without her permission, of how the candlelight moved across the line of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows, the way his hands rested on the windowsill, with a stillness that she was coming to understand was not emptiness, but held weight. "You are not afraid," he said. It was observation, not question. "I am frightened," she said honestly. "I have simply had a great deal of practice at not allowing it to alter my conduct." He looked at her then. Direct. The way he had looked at her the first morning over the will. She felt it again in the base of her throat. "I have been ungracious," he said. "In these weeks. I am aware of it. I do not offer it as a defect I cannot help." "You have been efficient," she said, "which is what the situation required. That is a generous construction." "I am not generous by nature," she said. "I am accurate." The corner of his mouth moved again, the way it had in the study that first morning, and this time it stayed a moment longer before it went. She said good night and took her candle and went to bed. What she did not know, lying awake in the small cold room that had been hers for 4 years, was that he remained at that window for a very long time after she left, and that he was thinking about a woman he had never adequately seen until 3 weeks ago, and that the thought arrived with a quality of disturbance he had not felt in 4 years, since a winter morning in London when a message had come too late. His wife had died in the autumn of 1813. Her name was Catherine. She had been 22. The child, a daughter, had lived 6 hours. Greystone had been in Yorkshire at the time, attending to an estate matter that could have waited, and had not. The message reached him 2 days into his journey. He had ridden through a night and a day, and arrived to find it finished and over, and a house that was very quiet in the way that a house is quiet when no one is left to make noise. He had not permitted himself, since then, to be anywhere that mattered. He had made of distance and duty a kind of architecture, and he had lived inside it steadily, and it had served him. He did not tell Cecily this, in the late quiet of his borrowed study at Ashmore, With the fire burning low and the will spread on the desk and the small brass key lying beside it, he took the key up and turned it in his fingers. The will described it precisely. A small brass key on a worn leather cord, belonging to Thomas Hargrove, the late Earl's younger brother, who had died in 1807, who had left a daughter he had never formally acknowledged. Thomas Hargrove, whose surname Cecily carried. Who had been, the late Earl had written in his revised will, with the plain precision of a man who had spent too long not saying it, her father. Greystone set the key down. He understood now why the will had been hidden. He did not yet have proof of who had hidden it. The authentication letter came on a Thursday, 6 days after Cecily's discovery. The morning it arrived, Greystone requested that the documents be assembled in the Great Hall and that all interested parties be present. He said this in his quietest, most procedural voice, which was the voice, Cecily had learned, that meant he had made a decision and was not inviting debate about it. She dressed with more care than usual, in the cleanest of her 3 gowns, and she sat in the chair that was placed for her at the long table. And she waited. What she had not anticipated, because she had perhaps made the error of trusting in procedure, was that Abel Trask had been preparing. Trask was a man of 50, with small, pale eyes, and the manner of someone who has spent a career constructing sentences designed to mean one thing on the surface and another underneath. He had been the late Earl's solicitor for 20 years and the Pell family's man of business for the last 5, and he had been in the room when the late Earl signed the revised will, because he had drafted it. He had also been in the room, 6 months later, when the Earl grew suddenly and unexpectedly unwell, and it was during that illness that the document had disappeared from the estate's official records. Trask had been careful. He had not destroyed the will, which would have been fraud of an unambiguous kind. He had merely relocated it to a place no one was likely to look, and he had waited for events to take their course. They had taken their course quite satisfactorily for 3 years, and then a servant had gone into the chapel at an inconvenient hour, and now he was sitting in the Great Hall with an authentication letter in Greystone's hands and a problem that required a different kind of architecture. Greystone read the letter aloud. The words of the London expert were precise and without hesitation. The will was in the late Earl's own hand, the paper consistent with the period, the seal unbroken and legitimate. Mrs. Pell was seated across the table, and Cecily watched her face and saw the moment it registered. The pearl choker, the claret gown, the fan held at its customary measured height. The confidence of a woman who has never lost. It was then that Trask placed his folded document on the table. "My lord," he said in a voice pitched to Carey, "I am compelled to raise a matter before these proceedings advance." He unfolded the paper with a deliberateness that was meant to feel like authority. "I have in my possession an affidavit. It was signed last week by a witness who was present at the drafting of the document in question. The witness states that the late Earl was not of sound mind at the time of signing." He paused. "The document Miss Hargrove produced is a forgery." A silence fell over the hall. Cecily felt it land in her chest like cold water. "Furthermore," Trask said, his voice finding a smoother register, "the matter of Miss Hargrove's standing in these proceedings bears examination. She is only a servant, and the claim she advances is one she has personal interest in advancing. This makes her account of the discovery unreliable by any standard of evidence." The room was very still. Greystone had not yet spoken. He was looking at the affidavit, which Trask had slid across the table. He read it in that same controlled way, his face showing nothing. It was Lionel Pell who filled the silence. He was smiling, because he was his mother's son, and he had learned to smile when the machinery went his way. "The family is, of course, sympathetic to Miss Hargrove's difficult position," he said. But one must weigh that sympathy against the reality. She was the Countess's reading companion. She is a domestic employee. Whatever she believes she found, the circumstances of the finding render it suspect. Cecily set her hands flat on the table. She did not speak. She had learned, in 4 years of service, and in 24 years of managing a world that found her presence convenient and her claims inconvenient, that the moment she showed what was happening inside her chest was the moment she would lose every advantage that composure had ever given her. So she set her hands flat on the table, and she breathed, and she looked at the affidavit Trask had produced with the expression of a woman who was reading it and not being destroyed by it. Greystone looked up. "I would like the name of this witness," he said. "The document speaks for itself," Trask said. "The document names a witness," Greystone said. "I would like to know where that witness may be found." A pause. "He is," Trask said, "abroad." Greystone put the affidavit down. "Conveniently," he said. He turned to Cecily. He looked at her in that direct way that she had come to feel as something distinct from scrutiny, something that was perhaps simply the experience of being seen by a person who was not looking for what they expected to find. "Miss Hargrove," he said, "the authentication stands. I am suspending this hearing, not abandoning it, until I have examined the matter of this affidavit further. Will you accept that distinction?" It was not quite a question, but it was offered with a deference that was not usual from him. "I accept it," she said. She rose and walked the length of the great hall. She did not hurry. She reached the door, and she passed through it, and she stood in the cold passage beyond. And she allowed herself, for the first time since Tuesday morning, to feel the full weight of what it meant that someone had tried to bury what she had found. The passage was narrow and unlit. The fire from the great hall threw a bar of light under the door, and beyond that bar, everything was the blue-gray of a November afternoon moving into early dusk. She could hear, distantly, the sound of chairs scraping as the assembled company dispersed, voices lowered for the occasion of someone else's difficulty. She pressed the back of her wrist against the cold stone wall, and she let the stone be cold against her. It helped, sometimes, to feel something that was simply and honestly what it was. She was standing in that passage, in the dark, when she heard his step. He came to a halt near enough that she could have turned and been within arm's reach of him. She heard him draw a breath. He began to lift a hand toward her. Some motion cut short before it arrived, and instead his arm came to rest at his side. The light from under the door found the edge of his coat. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air of the passage, and she did not turn yet, because she was not entirely certain she could do so without her face revealing things she was not prepared to have revealed. "I will not let it stand," he said. His voice was low and level, without performance. "You said it is a matter of procedure." "It is," he said. "But procedure is not neutral. Procedure is wielded. I know what that affidavit is, and I know what Trask is." She turned then, because she could not help it. In the thin light from the hall's distant fire, his face was difficult to read. She had been reading difficult things by insufficient light for most of her life. "What will you do?" she said. "What the situation requires," he said. And then, after a pause that was unusual for him, he said, "I did not go into breakfast this morning. I had no particular wish to sit at a table from which your chair was absent." She looked at him. He looked back. "That is not a procedural observation," she said carefully. "No," he said. "It is not." The morning after, Greystone rode to the nearest town and returned by midday with the vicar of the local parish, an elderly solicitor of impeccable reputation, named Mr. Ashby, and a small wooden box that he had collected from the Ashmore estate room. where it had apparently been lodged under a secondary register in the late Earl's archive for 3 years. The box was locked. The key that fitted was a small tarnished brass key on a worn leather cord. Cecily's key. He had known when he read the hidden will the first morning that the late Earl had described the key precisely and had noted its purpose. It was the key to a secondary document box, one kept separate from the estate's main records, in which Thomas Hargrove had placed letters and papers that the Earl had promised to preserve. The box contained, among other things, a letter in the late Earl's hand addressed to his solicitor, undated, instructing that the revised will's terms be honored and naming the document box as the corroborating evidence. It also contained a letter in Trask's hand to the late Earl, dated in the autumn of 1813, recommending that the revised will be reconsidered in light of certain family interests. The late Earl had written across the bottom of that letter, in the same spare, slanted hand Cecily knew, "I do not intend to reconsider it. The interests of the family are not the sole interests I am obliged to serve." Greystone laid these documents on the table of the great hall with the care of a man who has waited until he had everything before he moved. Lionel Pell had been summoned. Mrs. Dorothea Pell arrived before him, still in her claret gown, still with the fan. Trask came last, with the slightly deflated manner of a man who knows the architecture he has been relying on is no longer weight-bearing. Greystone opened the proceedings without preamble. "The witness named in Mr. Trask's affidavit," he said, "is a Mr. George Fillmore, formerly in the late Earl's employ. Mr. Fillmore is not abroad. He is in the village of Ashton Clear, where he has lived since his discharge from this estate. Mr. Ashby has spoken to him this morning." A pause. "Mr. Fillmore states that he signed the affidavit under Mr. Trask's instruction, in exchange for the cancellation of a private debt. He states that he was not present at the drafting of the will in question, and has no knowledge of the late Earl's mental condition on the day of signing." The room was very quiet. Trask said, "My lord, I must object to this characterization," and his voice had lost its smooth register. "You may object in writing to the appropriate court," Greystone said. "I will provide the direction." Mrs. Pell had not moved. Her fan was still. Her face, Cecily saw, had undergone the specific transition of a woman whose script has run out of lines, and who is encountering, perhaps for the first time in a very long while, the experience of being wrong. "Miss Hargrove brought the will forward," Trask said. He was looking at the assembled witnesses now. The vicar, the solicitor Ashby, the 2 Pell footmen who had come in as required by procedure. His voice was gathering itself into its last available argument. "Whatever these letters say, whatever Mr. Fillmore now claims, the fact remains that she is only a servant, that she had every incentive to produce a document in her own favor," Trask said. His voice had found something raw beneath its smooth register, a note she recognized as the first fracture in confidence. He was still speaking when Greystone rose. Greystone had come to his feet. He did not raise his voice. He crossed the floor of the great hall in the unhurried, deliberate way of a man who has long known that proximity is more convincing than volume, and he came to stand between Cecily and the solicitor's side of the table. "Miss Hargrove found what Ashmore owes her," he said. "She keeps it all." The hall was absolutely still. Mrs. Pell's fan dropped slightly. Lionel Pell was looking at the table. Abel Trask's face had gone the color of old chalk. Mr. Ashby, who was 83 and had practiced law since before half the people in the room were born, made a small sound of satisfaction in the back of his throat. Greystone turned to the vicar. "Reverend Marsh, I will ask you to witness the formal proceedings. Miss Hargrove, if you will remain." Cecily remained. It was done by the late afternoon. The revised will was authenticated, the bequest recorded. The Pell claim reduced to what the first will had assigned, and the second will had not revoked. It was not a great sum that Cecily inherited. It was a modest house in the village of Hargrove Cross, where her Uncle Thomas had been born and had died, and a small annual income that would allow her to live as the late Earl had clearly intended, not as a servant, but as a woman with a quiet life of her own, and no further obligation to fold herself into anyone else's household. There was also a codicil acknowledging what she was: Thomas Hargrove's natural daughter, the late Earl's niece, by a brother he had loved and grieved. That acknowledgment, Cecily thought, sitting in the great hall as the afternoon light shifted to gold through the tall windows, was the part she could not quite hold steadily in her mind, the part that kept sliding away before she could press her hands around it. The Pells left Ashmore before dinner. Mrs. Dorothea Pell went through the entrance hall in her claret gown with the carriage already at the door, and she paused once near the foot of the stairs and looked back at nothing in particular, and Cecily did not gloat. There was nothing in her that wanted to. She only thought of a woman who had been told her whole life that the world was arranged in a certain way, and who was learning at 56 that it was arranged somewhat differently. Greystone found her in the chapel at dusk. She had gone back the way she always had, because the silence still belonged to no one, and because she wanted to stand for a moment in the place where it had all begun and allow herself to understand that it was over. The flagstone had been replaced. The hollow beneath it was empty. The small prayer book was on the window ledge as it had always been, thin-paged and belonging to no one in particular. He stood in the doorway. She turned. "I am told," he said, "that the house in Hargrove Cross is in reasonable condition. The late Earl had it maintained." "I did not know there was a house," she said. "I did not know there was anything. There is now." A pause. "I am also told that you read to Tommy from the prayer book. Some weeks ago. In this room." She looked at him. "You were in the doorway," she said. "I was. Why did you not announce yourself?" He said nothing for a moment. The evening light through the chapel's single window was the last of the day's gold, touching the stone walls and the old pews and the dark navy of his coat. "I was not certain I deserved to interrupt," he said. She understood him. She thought of a man who had organized his life around the principle that presence was a thing he had forfeited the right to, and who was standing in a chapel doorway at dusk, offering something that cost him considerably more than a legal decision. He reached into his breast pocket. He held out the small, tarnished brass key on its worn leather cord. "This was your father's," he said. She crossed the chapel. She did not hurry. She stood before him, and she took the key. And when she took it, his hand did not immediately withdraw, and her fingers remained against his for a moment in the quiet. "James," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were not cold, that had never been cold, that were simply the eyes of a man who had learned to hold everything. He felt a very long distance from the surface, and he said, with a quiet she recognized as the opposite of emptiness, "Yes." She placed her free hand in his. Not the hand that held the key, but the other one. The one that had nothing in it. He took it. He closed his fingers around it with a steadiness that was his particular variety of tenderness, and they stood in the chapel doorway as the last of the gold left the sky, and the stone estate beyond them settled into the blue of evening. She had not expected to be chosen. She had expected for so long that the world's verdict on her was the final verdict, that she was the reading companion, the servant, the woman at the end of the table in the plain gray-green gown, the woman with no name worth carrying and no claim worth honoring. She had not expected that the world was wrong. The house in Hargrove Cross was small and stone and very quiet in the evenings. She moved into it in December, and Greystone had ridden from his own estate to carry 2 boxes she did not need carried, and to stand in the doorway of the kitchen looking at the window ledge as if he were calculating how long it would take him to ride back. And she had told him it was a long way in the cold, and there was no reason to do it the same day. He had agreed, in the way of a man who had already decided, but required permission, to stop pretending otherwise. By the following spring there was a second name at the door, and a fire that did not go out in the evenings, and a small prayer book on the window ledge above the kitchen table where the morning light fell best. The brass key hung on a cord at her throat, tucked beneath her collar, warm from her skin. Tommy came to visit in the summers, and she taught him to read from that same worn prayer book, and he was a quick study, better than he believed himself to be, which she told him so consistently that eventually he began to believe it. The Earl of Greystone was not a man much given to softness. He was still precise, and still given to long silences, and still inclined to issue instructions that sounded like commands and meant something else. He had learned, or was learning, that presence was not a thing he had forfeited, that the distance he had built between himself and the world was architecture, and architecture could be taken down, stone by stone, with sufficient patience on both sides. He had found, in the chapel of a Regency estate on an October morning when a flagstone moved, that someone had hidden a truth because they were afraid of what it would overturn. He had found, in the same place, at dusk, that he was no longer afraid. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. If you have stayed through to the end of this story, I am glad you were here. Leave a word in the comments for the woman who found what was buried and the man who finally stopped hiding from the living.